Hello and welcome to the show. Most of the debates that we have about taxation, they're about the what, the rates, the base, who pays. Today, I want to talk about the how we get to particular tax policies. And this is highly relevant in Australia at the moment with the big debate over capital gains taxation. A couple of episodes ago, I talked about the government's proposed changes and how they're leading to a very substantial increase in the taxation of capital gains, and many economists are concerned about that. So we covered that a couple of episodes ago, so you can go check out that episode. I'll link to it in the show notes. I won't go back over that. I'm going to talk about the process, how the economic policy gets made, because I think that's important. And I think there are some severe deficiencies in that in Australia at the moment. There have always been issues, but I think it was much better, say, 20 or 30 years ago when I was first starting out in economics. And I'm coming at this from my experience, so experience within the Australian Treasury, within other public service agencies where I've been involved in policy development. And also I'm coming at it based on my experience as a professional economist working outside of government, but often on projects for clients where the issues are related to government policies in some way, or it may relate to a government infrastructure project. It may relate to a government measure of some kind for the housing market, for example. So I've got significant experience in seeing policy developed, and I'd like to think that I've got taken out some lessons from that, that I understand what makes good policy and what doesn't make good policy. And what I'm concerned about is that what we've seen with this latest, with these changes to capital gains tax, to negative gearing, they aren't consistent with a good policy making process. And I think that point is independent of what I think about the policy changes themselves. I'm not a fan of the policy changes. You can go back to our episode a couple of weeks ago, but that is a separate issue from the one where there's an underlying problem with the process, and that has directly contributed to the problems with the design of this capital gains tax, these changes. And this is something that with a better process, these problems that have come up, these unanticipated problems, or problems that the government doesn't seem to have anticipated because it's had to backflip on some aspects of it. It's having to exempt startups, for example, and it has to clarify the treatment of trusts that are set up when people pass away. So it's had to make various changes because it didn't do its homework in the first place. Okay, so while we're talking about an issue here in Australia at the moment, this is universal, I would say, this episode. It's relevant to policy development in other countries. And the principles that I'm going to be outlining, the potential problems, I think they carry across to other jurisdictions, not just Australia. I think they're relevant for the US, for the UK, Canada, New Zealand, etc. Okay, so that's the setup for the episode. That's what we're going to be talking about. I'm going to be drawing on some of the conversation that John Humphreys and I had on our latest live stream, the Death and Taxes live stream every Thursday night. We had a conversation with Derek Francis, who is a former economist for the New South Wales Parliamentary Budget Office. He's worked for a major investment bank. He runs a little hedge fund at the moment. He's been one of the most prominent critics of the capital gains tax changes. And we had a great conversation with Derek. And it turns out I worked with Derek's brother, Jeff, in the Treasury many years ago now. And both Derek and Jeff are good value. And so it was good having Derek on the show on our live stream to talk about the capital gains tax and how we're going to end up with the highest capital gains tax in the world, with all of the adverse implications for business investment, for productivity that entails. Okay, so before we get into it, I just want to thank our sponsor, Lumo Coffee. So Lumo Coffee, it's a really beautiful coffee. I like their bright side beans. They're very smooth. I really like it. The coffee, it comes from Peru. It's rich in antioxidants. And listeners of Economics Explored, or viewers now that I've started putting these videos on YouTube, still early days with that in terms of getting the production quality up, but listeners or viewers can get a 10% discount, and I'll put the details in the show notes. So for those of you who have purchased Lumo so far, if you're one of those people, thank you. It does help support the show, and it's good to know that that people are enjoying the Lumo coffee. Okay, without further ado, let's get into it. So, what I want to cover this episode is what a good policy process looks like, and I want to go back to what happened in the late 90s when the Howard government was preparing to introduce the GST, when it was developing the policy and then proposing it to the Australian people in an election. I wasn't in the Treasury at the time. I was still at uni. However, when I ended up in Treasury in the 2000s, I did hear a lot about it, and this process was always talked about by the senior people there, and I got a sense of just how much work went into all the analysis that that was led by Ken Henry at the time, working for Ted Evans, and I just got the sense of all of the number crunching, understanding how they modelled this complex change from the existing sales taxes they had in place to a value-added tax, a goods and services tax, which has been controversial in Australia. But because they did the work and there was detailed work, that the government was upfront about what it was doing, and it consulted, it took the policy change to an election. It put out a white paper in August 1998. The election was in October 1998. It had come into office in 1996, promising not to introduce a GST. And so for it to then go and introduce a GST, it recognised it would have to seek a new mandate from the electorate. And hence, that's why it did the work and developed a detailed white paper, which has modelling of how this tax proposal, complemented with some changes to the welfare payments. I think it was family benefits. I'll have to check that. I was having a look at it before. But essentially, they modelled the impacts of the taxation policy changes and the changes to assistance and worked out how it would affect households of different types, so pensioners versus dual income earners with kids. They worked out how it was going to affect different industries because the industry impacts were different depending on, due to the replacement of the existing sales taxes, which had uneven impacts across industries with the GST. And so they were able to show which industries, the price impacts. Well, to what extent would this increase prices? Because they're taking these sales taxes off and putting a GST on, or would it decrease prices? And there are different effects across industries. And they did the modelling. They used what was called the PRIS mod, which is let me get this right, prices, revenue incidence simulation model. So this is a detailed model based on the input-output tables. It's a input-output price model, or a Leontief price model, named after Vasily Leontief, the Harvard economist who developed the first set of input-output tables for the US. And what they were able to do was then trace through the impacts of this policy change on different industries. And they've got all the results. They've published them. You can see them. It's a very impressive piece of work, and it's a government white paper. So before we entered this very rushed, or what's the word? How do I express it? I mean, there's an element of making it up as they go along nowadays. There doesn't seem to be as much deliberate or considered policy making as there once was. Once upon a time, governments would, often they'd have a green paper whereby they would canvass different policy options, and then they'd get feedback on that. There'd be consultations. They might do some modelling, and then they would choose, or they'd narrow down the options and do some further analysis and come to a recommendation and present a white paper to the public. This is how they used to do it. And I think this was a much better process than what we've seen with these current changes to the capital gains tax and negative gearing, which are very significant policy changes. They're policy changes that the government denied that they were going to introduce prior to the last election. They went to the election promising not to make these changes. And what they've done is that they've announced them on budget night. So the budget last month, and there were leaks about it. There was people knew that they were probably going to make some changes, but we didn't know precisely what. The details weren't out there. And so therefore, when people see the model or what they're proposing on budget night, there's a huge reaction, and all of the sharp financial minds figured out these are the problems. These are all of the anomalies. These are the unintended consequences. And I think it's a direct, or it follows from the fact that they had a bad process to begin with, that they didn't consult properly, they didn't do the work, they didn't crunch the numbers, and they didn't release a white paper, as the Howard government did back in the late 90s. Now, this is not to put the Howard government on a pedestal. I mean, there were plenty of they had their own issues with some of their policies. My old boss Ken Henry gave a famous speech back in might have been 2007. It must have been. Where he was highly critical of the development of the National Water Plan. So I'm not necessarily saying, oh, well, this government's terrible relative to the Howard government. I don't want this to be a political comment, but I just want to point out that they at least did that GST right. They got that correct, and that process that should serve as a template. That's the type of thing we should be doing all the time, and with major policy changes. And the trouble that this current government is in, the Albanese government is in Australia, is due to not following good policy process. So they've really brought it on themselves. So that's I think that's a good example. I mean, there are examples where I've been involved in policy development where it's been much improved by doing the number crunching. I mean, the way I got into policy development was because of whatever proficiency with number crunching or modeling that I have. That meant that I was someone who was sought after by senior people in the agency I was in Queensland government. So I worked with, probably one of the best people I ever worked with, Paul Goldsborough, who was a very savvy operator in Department of Industrial Relations in Queensland, and I helped Paul with a change to the funding of workplace health and safety in Queensland. This is about 20 years ago, with a levy on workers' compensation that was funded by an expansion of the base for the calculation of the work cover levy by including super in the base. And we use that to replace some existing charges on business for registering plant and equipment, lifts, and all sorts of devices that we were requiring businesses to register with the department. We cut those fees, if I remember correctly. I do remember that what was a very good part of that experience was that we did do the modelling. We worked out the impact of these changes of this expansion of the base for calculating workers' comp. I worked it out. I crunched the numbers on the industry impacts. And so we had that analysis in the cabinet submission. And Paul did all of the difficult stakeholder consultation work, dealing with the business community, dealing with the unions. And I think that went very well. So I was lucky enough early in my career to have an introduction to sound policy or good policy making process. And so I think I've got a natural or I've got a radar for detecting when process is good versus process is bad. And I just looked at what's happened with this negative gearing and the CGT changes in Australia, and I've just realised this is a mess. I mean, I'd like to think that when I was working in Treasury, or the Treasury when I was there, would not have made this type of error, would not have stuffed up, would not have had design features of this capital gains tax that was going to discourage so much investment and has led the government to now have to carve out the tech sector. But it's not just discouraging the tech sector, it's discouraging mining exploration and a whole bunch of other business activity and investment. So, I mean, we've covered that in a previous episode. I won't go back over that, but I think it's a result of that poor process. They didn't have the error correction mechanism in place before this policy was announced and before it was legislated. So very poor process, very disappointing. I mean, I don't take any pleasure in criticising the Treasury. I think Treasury is an important institution. It's mentioned in the Australian Constitution. It's had a storied history. I mean, I work with some of the best people I ever worked with were in the Treasury, and I don't regret my time there. But I look at what's happening to Treasury now, and it's just incredibly disappointing. Okay, so I'll put a link to the the white paper that the Howard government introduced in 1998 prior to the election, which is something that this current government did not do. It's just announced a policy package that it didn't give any signal that it was going to before the last election, and indeed it said it would not. And hence the criticisms about the government's honesty and integrity, which are, in my opinion, are justified. I mean, all politicians are all politicians will tell untruths. There's no doubt about that. And I think they can be most of, maybe not all, but most of them can be economical with the truth. But given how many times the government was asked whether they'd do this or not, and they said, no, we're not going to do it, I think this is a pretty bad case. Okay. So just to reiterate, the problems are that this was done with a bit of a cloak of secrecy. Internally, it was done hush-hush. There wasn't the consultation that would be that I think would have made any policy change much better, much less likely to have unintended consequences. And what they're experiencing now is a result of just botching that process. Okay, so what we might go to now is a clip from my conversation with Derek, the conversation that John and I had with Derek, and this is about another recent failure of the Treasury, and I suppose this is possibly a pattern, and it's another major policy area where the Treasury advice and analysis has let the country down to a significant extent, and it relates to the taxation of cigarettes. So I'll just play this clip, and then I'll catch up with you after the clip. Derek, you reminded me of something where you're talking effectively about a Laffer curve. I mean, that's what we've done with cigarette excise. And I mean, Sinclair Davidson's been brilliant on that lately. So, with all of this, the funny, the ironic post.
It's the Laffer curve,
Why weren't we warned about this? And of course we were warned, including by Sinclair.
I'll tell you a funny story on that, Gene, as well. So my brother, Jeff, he produced an internal Treasury briefing saying, look, if you do this increase in tax, it's going to decrease the tax revenue. and he was shut out. They said, we don't want this research coming out because it's not the Treasury way. And he was shown to be right. So,
well, it's not the Treasury way, because Treasury just assumes that people never respond to incentives, which is a remarkably dumb assumption, which we just know is wrong. So
Okay, so according to Derek, there was at least one person who saw the problem with the massive hike in the cigarette excise, which has now created this huge black market because no one wants to pay just the ridiculous prices for cigarettes that you purchase legally from a supermarket where I don't know what they are. I don't smoke, but they're $30, $40, maybe even higher. I should check that. But what it's done is that it's encouraged people to go to these vape stores or the tobacco stores, the vape stores, and many of them, it appears, are selling illegal cigarettes. So cigarettes where they've dodged the excise, and they're much cheaper. And what's happened, consequently, is that government tax revenues fallen. So that's that Laffer curve we were talking about. So just a absolute schmozzle in terms of government policy making. Now, at least it sounds like Jeff Francis in Treasury had identified this could be a problem, but he wasn't listened to internally. So it obviously went against the analysis that was coming out of the the tax analysis area in the Treasury, and his analysis, his dissent was seen as unhelpful, and it didn't impact the policy, unfortunately. So that again is a black mark against the current Treasury, and perhaps it suggests that there's not that robust culture of internal debate, of putting high stock in the truth, in coming to the right answer, and being willing to have that debate. And it doesn't matter whether you're right or wrong. What matters is that the Treasury is right. And it looks like that has been forgotten. So they've lost that. What we're also seeing in Derek's view, and this is a very very well. What's the word? It's a significant attack on the Treasury. This in this clip that I'm going to play from Derek, it's very strong criticism that in his view, in his opinion, Treasury knows about some of these problems with the capital gains tax and the negative gearing changes, but it's not briefing the Treasurer about all of the issues. So this is a very serious accusation. If this is true, I can't verify it. I mean, I could try to talk to people in Treasury, but I doubt they would tell me one way or the other. But it's an interesting idea. I mean, it is very possible that bureaucrats could understand that there are issues, and they may think, well, we'll just sort them out, and in the implementation phase, we'll sort them out via regulations. Everything will be fine. There's no need to tell the minister. I think sometimes in public service there is that reluctance to break bad news to the minister, to the treasurer. There's a fear of causing a problem for the minister. I well remember that. And so they will be very, very reluctant to come clean on some of, if there are problems, if there are issues they're aware of, they well may not brief the minister or the treasurer. And look, in some cases there could be a plausible deniability part of it too. There could be perhaps there are communications, but they're being done verbally, and they're not being put in writing. I mean, that's another possibility. I don't know. All I know is that the process has clearly failed, and we've ended up with a tax policy that has had a lot of issues in its design, unintended consequences, and it's a tax policy that is highly unpopular and is contributing to the cynicism, the lack of trust that the public has in our politicians, in the people running the country, both the people in the government, the people in the bureaucracy, and it's contributing to people being more receptive to One Nation, to what was previously regarded as a fringe party, as a party that was not ready for government, that had all sorts of issues. But what's happened is that this is just another aspect, something else that's happened with our politics, with our policy making, that is contributing to the disillusionment that many Australians have with the system, and that is helping to fuel the rise of One Nation. Okay, so let's listen to that clip of of Derek. I'm confusing him with his brother, of Derek making that point, and I'll be interested in your thoughts on it. So if you have any thoughts on what Derek has to say, then or what I have to say, or John, then please get in touch. You can email me, contact@economicsexplored.com. I would love to hear from you, but for now, let's listen to the clip.
Yeah. What they're trying to do at the moment is they're trying to be in denial, where they're actually being dishonest with the Treasurer, and they're not telling him the extent of the problem or the size of the problem. The Treasury itself is engaged in a huge cover-up, and the briefings they're giving to Jim Chalmers that he's presenting to Parliament, they are dishonest lies. Jim Chalmers is saying that he's doing this to better align the labour and capital tax rate. In fact, the current tax on capital gains is 30%, and the labour tax rate is 27%, so it's already above. Under this new system, the capital gains tax goes to 55%, so it goes to double the rate of tax on labour. And the briefing notes they've given Jim Chalmers that says it goes from 19 to 21, they're not worth the paper they're written on. If you ask Jim Chalmers to release the modelling on it, he will refuse to do it, and the reason why is because then they'll be exposed for the frauds that they are.
Okay, so that was some very strong criticism of the Treasury from Derek. And yes, what do we make of that? Let me know. I think there are clearly issues. I'm not going to deny that. I would like to think that they aren't behaving in the way that Derek has suggested. However, I don't know. It's an awful thing to think about. What I do recognise is that they've presided over a process, or they've participated in a process that has clearly failed and led to such a poor policy outcome as we've talked about. So what's gone on? How have we got to this point? To what extent is it a result of the staff of the Treasury, the people in the Treasury? Do we have different people in the Treasury now from the people we had historically, or when Treasury was at its peak? I think probably before I got there, I'd say the 80s or the 90s, but still when I was there in the 2000s, it was still it was a high caliber department. We had very good people. Ken Henry, Martin Parkinson, David Gruen, among many others. And so there was a real culture of high performance. Now, I don't know. I mean, they've made some blunders, and you do have to wonder why are they missing things that they may have picked up they probably would have picked up in the past. Why are they making so many errors? And Derek's got a theory about that, and let's listen to Derek. And again, let me know what you think. He's got an interesting hypothesis with this one. Okay.
Treasury for about the last 10 years has been much more interested in hitting their woke diversity and equity targets rather than actually employing genuine economists. So most of the genuine economists have left. They haven't got any there. If they'd had anyone that had worked investing in markets, they would have immediately told them that this doesn't work. So what this tells me is that no one spotted the error in Treasury, and I spotted it within 2 days, not even having access to them.
Yeah.
It tells me that they've got no one in there that has had practical experience working, investing in a stock market. And that tells me, that tells me that the whole pool in Treasury is just a ridiculous pool of useless people that don't know economics.
So does that mean?
But I think RW actually worked out what's actually going on here. And before we rip them too much, they've got a foolproof system of doing their modelling. It's based on cutting the head off a chicken and seeing where it falls lives per square. So thank you, RW. Sorry, Gene, you were about to say.
I was just wondering, does this mean that we should have something like the US system where,
yes.
where you have
regular alternation between private and public sector, so that people working in the public sector can work about the second, third, fourth round effects from any policy that they institute. It should be a rotational system, And if you've been 5 years in the government, you should have to be sort of automatically rotated out, and they should be paying salaries to attract good people from the private sector. You don't need many people in Treasury. You don't need 1,000 people in Treasury who all think the same. You need 5 or 10 really clever people that know what they're doing. Yeah.
Okay, so there was some more frank and fearless commentary from Derek there. Really enjoyed talking to Derek. He very much understood the issues with the CGT change, the asymmetric treatment of gains versus losses that meant that this became the fact that because of the way that they were treating losses, they weren't allowing you to inflation adjust those losses to help you significantly reduce your tax bill. It meant that this was much more of an increase in the capital gains tax than may be apparent initially. And this was something that Derek picked up. And that's what he was talking about with the error or the problem with it that he was able to pick up because rather than someone in the Treasury, because Treasury didn't have the experienced people that it needed to be able to pick up this problem. So if you want to do a deeper dive into that, I'll put a link in the show notes to the live stream that John and I did with Derek, and we really unpack that. We go through that in some detail, what the problem is there, so you can find out all about that if you want. It gets fairly technical as you might expect, but this is something where those technical details really matter a lot, and it's led to this bad policy design. Okay, if this was just an isolated incident, if this was just one blemish, this was just one issue with the current Treasury, then perhaps we go, okay, they stuffed up there. We all make mistakes from time to time. I'm certainly not perfect. But the problem is it's not an isolated incident, and there have been others, as I mentioned earlier, and one that I'm close to is the modelling that Treasury did on the home guarantee scheme. For instance, the 5% deposit scheme, where they came out with an estimate of the impact on the housing market, which suggested very slight impacts. However, what they didn't tell us was that they were presenting the modelling results after the market had settled down over 6 years, and they missed, or they didn't declare the huge or the really big short-term impact it could have. And this is something that's been borne out by the totality data, whereby you see that because so many first home buyers can now enter the market with only a 5% deposit, you have this big bring forward of demand. You have all these additional first home buyers coming in at the one time, and that's pushing up prices. That pushed up prices in the first 6 months in the markets that are more attractive or cheaper for first home buyers. And we see that we've seen this big impact, and it's perverse in a way because it means that some other people trying to buy a home, they'll have to pay higher prices. And, there could be there will be some first home buyers who they get this benefit, or they're able to take a 5%, buy a house with a 5% deposit, but then the prices are higher. So the benefits offset. So it's that's an example where their modelling has been insufficient, and they wouldn't release it under FOI. They would not release the details of their modelling. They released some of the briefings, but they were heavily redacted. Initially, they were going to release an email that I sent them. They challenged the modelling that Nicholas Gruen and I did in a report we prepared on the home guarantee scheme last year, which suggested that there would be very large short-term impacts. Treasury wrote to me, or they met with me, and they challenged the modelling, and I wrote back to them and essentially pointed out that their advice or their analysis was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how the housing market works. And as part of an FOI request, it looked like they were going to publish my response to them at one stage, but then eventually it wasn't released. So I just wonder whether they probably did their best to determine it was out of scope of the FOI request it was probably from Senator Bragg. I can't remember exactly who it must have been from. But it didn't end up being released, and it was possibly because it may have been embarrassing, because I essentially pointed out the problem with their modelling to the extent that I had some inkling of what they were doing or how they were thinking about it based on the conversation I had with them. Anyway, that might be a bit of a bit too much, too much inside baseball, as they say in the States. But it does go to show the problems we've got and the very real need to improve the quality of economic policy making, and before that, the economic analysis and the advice that is going to the government of the day. We need to reestablish a highly capable Treasury that is frank and fearless, that is providing the ministers with that hard-hitting analysis and advice that's so essential for policy. And unfortunately, we haven't had that. And I think that's a pretty clear message from this episode, from the clips that I've played. And look, I'll be interested in your thoughts. If you think I've been too hard, if you think Derek's been too strong in his criticism, then get in touch, contact at Economics Explored. I would love to hear from you. And just to finish off again, remember, we're sponsored by Lumo Coffee, high quality organic coffee from the highlands of Peru, rich in antioxidants. Economics Explored listeners and viewers can get a 10% discount. The details are in the show notes, so please check that out. It's a great coffee. I love it. Okay, so I think that's me. I think I've worn myself out talking about that. And again, thanks for joining me. It's great that you're interested in these important economic policy issues. And goodbye for now. And I will see you next time I'm recording. Okay, I'll see you next week.